Hello, I'm Miss Kilbenbond. In this video we're going to look at narrative writing, so short story writing, and focus on how you can revise for this part of your GCSE English Language Paper 2. So the learning objectives of the video are first of all that we explore a planning strategy to help you structure narrative writing, because planning is proven to improve the quality of your writing, and many students talk about finding that the hardest thing to get going and get their ideas and think about how to be able to plan for a story that's going to make sense and be structured when you only have 45 minutes to do so. Then we're going to revise some of the techniques that will help you write a cohesive and engaging and a convincing short story. And finally, but really importantly, we're going to bust the myth that you can't revise for a creative writing question, because you absolutely can. And by the end of this video, hopefully that's something that you will know exactly how to do. So you've got two exam papers there in front of you, just as an example to remind you what this part of the exam looks like. So this is paper 1, question 5. So what does it look like and where does narrative fit into that? But first of all, let's just remind ourselves that this is worth 40 marks. So 25% of your whole GCSE, 50% of paper 1. Really important that you give this the time and the preparation when you're revising and when you're sitting in the exam hall. 24 of those marks will go for your content and organisation. So that's why your ideas and planning for them and the structure of those ideas is so important. But 16 marks are going to go for technical accuracy, so spelling, punctuation, grammar, paragraphing, vocabulary. You really need to be confident when you walk into that exam that that's something that you've prepared for and you've thought about. Now, a narrative is different to a description. A narrative is a story. So in 45 minutes you're being asked to write a short story. Sometimes the question actually asks you to write the opening of a longer story. So you could think of that as being like an opening chapter. A narrative, a story, is going to need movement. It's going to need a plot. Things are going to need to happen, and you are almost definitely going to need characters, even if the only character is the narrator. So think about that as different from a description. You need characters, you need plot movement, and you could have some minimal dialogue, although I would advise that unless you're super confident with exactly how to punctuate it and how to use it skillfully, that dialogue can become quite tricky to make it sound convincing. So it's better to keep those two quite small little moments in your narrative writing. On the exam paper on the left-hand side, you'll see that the narrative question comes at the bottom, so it's not linked to the picture. The narrative question says, write a story about an event that cannot be explained. On the right-hand side, the exam paper narrative question has linked itself to the image. At the top there, write a story about a magical world as suggested by this picture. So they're both essentially asking the same thing, that you write a piece of narrative, you write a short story. One gives you a photograph as a prompt to set you going with ideas. The other gives you a topic that you need to use as a prompt for the ideas. At this point, it's important to say that we cannot predict exactly which will come up on your exam paper. It's also possible that you could have two narratives or two descriptions. So what's important here is that you don't go into the exam with a certain fixed mindset about what you think you are going to do, because we just don't know how it's going to present on that exam paper. So you need to be clear that you know how to write a narrative and you know how to write a description, even if you have a favourite that you hope is going to come up. So let's start by looking at a roller coaster. And why we're going to look at a roller coaster is because it's an interesting way to think about what a story actually does. So if we think about the conventional storytelling structure, so what most stories try and stick to, we can divide it into the 5 parts of this roller coaster ride. Part number 1 we could call our setup. So that's where there's some kind of introduction to the story, a background, a setting of the scene, if you like. That's usually followed by the bit of the roller coaster that slowly climbs up to the sort of steep summit, an inciting incident or a rising action, sometimes you'll see it's called. And all that means is that a story, often after establishing and introducing character or background, events start to build that's leading up to usually a problem where something's going to go wrong, a conflict. And that's that point at the top of the roller coaster where you're just sort of slowly about to tip over the climax, the main event, the most exciting moment. The bit where you whiz down the other side, number 4, is the falling action, where the characters usually are working to solve the problem, and then stories end with number 5, the resolution, how things end up once that problem has been solved. Now, those of you who read regularly will quickly think, well, not all stories follow that exactly, and some writers very cleverly play around with that order. So they might, for example, start their story with the climax, so the story starts at the top of the roller coaster, if you like, and that's brilliant. If you're confident with playing around with the structure, then do so, but just understanding that that structure, that conventional storytelling structure exists, might help you when you're thinking about how to answer paper 1, question 5, the narrative. Now, another thing that can help you understand this idea of how to write a narrative is to think about this technique that you're going to see appearing on this slide here. And it starts with a drop. So what you're doing to your reader at the start of your story is you're dropping them into something that's already happening. And especially with a short story where you don't have a lot of time, this is a really clever way to be able to write something that's convincing and engaging, that you immediately drop your reader into something exciting, tense. You almost start with that climax. There's a sense of movement. And the drop is followed by the zoom. So having dropped the reader into something dramatic, you then zoom in on a particular character or particular event and explore that in a little bit more detail before introducing the flash. So the flash could be a flash back in time, or it could be something else that totally changes the sort of shifts the mood, the focus in an interesting way. And then obviously your story is going to need to have an end. It doesn't have to be an end that's satisfying. It could be an ending that leaves lots of questions unanswered, but it does need to feel like it's got some kind of closure to enable you to get marks for thinking about structure. But finally, and in the middle of this diagram, we've got this thread or a motif. And why I've added this into the drop, the zoom, the flash and the end is because if you're a really skilled writer, a thread enables you to link all of your ideas together. So it might be that there's a motif, by the way, is a recurring symbol, something that keeps popping up. So if you can, experiment with starting off in your story with perhaps something in that drop section that keeps reoccurring. It could be something really simple, like a colour that becomes a really strong theme that threads everything together. It could be a character. It could be the weather. So whatever it is that you choose, if you want to try and be really clever, just try and think of something that's threading its way through your story so the reader feels that there's some kind of connection to each paragraph that then ends up being tidily tied up, if you like, at the end. Now, the success of that drop part of that structure is going to depend on how well you can hook your reader in with your opening sentences. So really important that that's something that you practice when you're revising, because if you start in a way that's not engaging, it's very difficult to convince your reader, and your reader of course will be the examiner, that they are buying into your story and really believing in it. So definitely worth practicing hooking in that bookworm, hooking in your reader. So here's some examples that we'll just quickly think about how they are successful as a hook. Bleary-eyed, I went downstairs for breakfast. The first sentence, nice start. It doesn't start with the. We've got bleary-eyed, an interesting start. We immediately get the sense of someone who's tired. But look what happens after that first sentence. The house was empty. Even the furniture had gone. So that second sentence introducing immediately some kind of problem, some kind of crisis, some kind of climax. And we've got lots of questions about where's it gone? Why is it gone? Were they expecting that it might have been gone? What's happening? So in this next one, 3 of us, we were the only ones left, the only ones to make it to the island. So we've got some great sentence structure and punctuation here. 3 of us, a simple sentence. It doesn't tell us a lot, but that's good because it gives us lots of questions about who these 3 people might be. We were the only ones left. That's quite a dramatic statement, isn't it? But then we've got the semicolon, the only ones, so repetition there, to make it to the island. So now we've immediately got a setting, we've got something that's making this even more interesting before dropping us into more detail. Now this next example starts with dialogue, which can also be a good way of dropping your reader in and hooking their attention. "What have you done?" the headmaster bellowed. All eyes now turned to me as he stood over the lifeless body on the playground. And there's lots going on here. We've got the interesting sort of bellowing headmaster at the beginning with that dialogue, but now we've got this shock second sentence where I don't think many readers would have expected there to be a lifeless body on the playground. I had never seen a ghost, but like they say, there is a first time for everything. So we've got a first person narrator here, and there's a little bit of humour, isn't there, as well as shock. I had never seen a ghost, that kind of statement opening, so we're immediately starting to think, oh, could this be a ghost story? But like they say, there is a first time for everything. So again, adding intrigue where we now want to know, well, what happened here? What are we going to find out about this ghost experience, this ghost encounter? My next door neighbours, the Johnsons, were all asleep in their coffins when I climbed the fence to get the ball. So brilliant sort of oxymoron, if you like, here, of a very normal thing about a narrator, presumably a child, talking about next door neighbours, talking about climbing the fence to get a ball, things that we can all relate to, except for the neighbours, whose name is very ordinary, yet they're all asleep in their coffins. So we've got that immediate throwing the reader off centre, so we want to know exactly what's going on with this family. And then finally, here's another example to think about. As she walked along the street, the tiny dragon in her pocket stirred restlessly. So again, we've got that idea of a character doing something seemingly normal, walking along a street, yet something seeming very abnormal is happening at the same time. It's really important then, once you've established that hook, that as you develop your writing for your narrative, you use this technique of show, don't tell. So I'm going to demonstrate to you what this means. So we've got this sentence here. Sam walked towards the door feeling nervous about her interview with the head teacher. There's nothing technically wrong with that sentence. But if we think about it like the idea of the hook again, it's not really hooking us in a particularly fascinating way. And in fact, what it's doing is it's just telling us the story. It's telling us that Sam's walked towards the door. It's telling us that Sam is feeling nervous. It's telling us that she's about to have an interview with the head teacher. There's not a lot of work that we as the reader can be doing around that. So let's look at how this next version of the same thing improves the writer's expertise. Sam's stomach twisted itself into knots as she slowly approached the glossy door ahead of her. Now essentially we've got the same thing happening here. We've got Sam walking towards the door feeling nervous about her interview with the head teacher. That's still what's happening, but now we've got a writer who's showing us, not telling us. The writer's not telling us that Sam is nervous. The writer's showing us by describing Sam's stomach as twisting itself into knots, which most readers are going to immediately recognise as nerves and anxiety. She's slowly approaching the door, which suggests reluctance. The fact that the door is glossy gives a sense that whoever's behind it has probably perhaps got authority over her. What about this version? Head teacher, knock and wait. The words seemed to shout down the corridor as Sam crept towards the door, feeling sick about the interrogation that awaited her. So exactly the same thing's happening yet again, but this time we've got something very different in terms of the way in which that's described. So we've got this sort of personification of the words on the door, shouting down the corridor. We've got Sam creeping, showing that she's afraid and nervous, feeling sick, and then we've changed the word here, interview, to interrogation, which makes it sound much more intimidating. So better vocabulary. And then just one more example, because this is such an important technique to master. Show, don't tell, something that you can really practice for your revision. Here's our first sentence that's technically accurate, but is telling us, not showing us. Sam thought he was being followed down the alleyway and started running. We're not doing any work again as the reader. We're being told exactly what's happening. It doesn't leave much for our imagination. But this one's much better. Glancing nervously back over his shoulder, Sam's heart raced as he stumbled down the dark and gloomy alleyway. So we're still following Sam, who's walking down the alleyway or running down the alleyway feeling like he's being followed. But now we've been given this idea that glancing nervously back over his shoulder, so we get the feeling there might be someone behind Sam. Sam's heart's racing, so showing us those nerves, that anxiety. That stumbled rather than running, much more interesting verb choice there, more ambitious vocabulary. And the alleyway has now got these adjectives dark and gloomy, which creates this sense of foreboding. Or what about this one? Haunted by the fear of the figure he was sure stalked him, Sam clenched his keys tightly in his fist as he quickened his step to hasten along the eerie, cobbled alleyway. So starting with that haunted immediately changes the atmosphere. It starts me anyway thinking, well, is it actually a person who's following Sam here or not? The fear of the figure, we've got some alliteration there, and then sure stalked him, some more alliteration, some sibilants there, and that choice of stalked again, making this really feel quite sinister. Sam clenched his keys tightly in his fist, so inferring that he is frightened of being attacked and is getting ready for self-defence as he quickened his step to hasten along the eerie, cobbled alleyway. So we started with the word haunted, now we've got eerie, so this brings a different sort of supernatural dimension to this description. So show, don't tell, really important that you practice that strategy. And we've touched on sentences and the importance of them, but your sentence variety really is the spice of life. If all of your sentences are the same length, if all of your sentences, and it's so dangerous when you're telling a story, start with the, then, next, or the character's name, or he or she, it really becomes quite a mundane story to read. You need to be really conscious of that and practice starting your sentences in really different varied ways and having varied lengths of sentences too. So again, not an exhaustive list here, but just some ideas for you. Sentence openers that can add more variety. Start with a simile, start with a preposition, start with an adverb, start with a connective, or start with a time preposition. And there are some examples for you there on the right hand side. So if this isn't familiar to you and you need a bit more time, you could pause the video here, just make a note of some of those examples and make sure you're clear about how you could use those in your own writing. And then remembering that we've got all those marks going for technical accuracy, in a story you might want to use some dialogue. So I've already said, don't overdo it, but little snippets of dialogue can be really powerful. If you're going to use it though, you must know how to punctuate it properly. So again, if that's something you know you need to go away and research, make sure you're doing that as part of your revision. You're not going to magically remember it on the day if you've not gone back and revisited how you punctuate speech. Just basic things like a new speaker speaking, you must start a new line. Knowing where you've got to have punctuation, whether it's inside or outside the speech marks, all those sorts of things you need to know. So let's think about this planning time then. You've got a 45-minute window to write your narrative writing. Really only 5 minutes of that is going to be spent planning. So if we imagine that the narrative title said write a short story about getting lost, let's think about how you could really valuably spend that 5 minutes coming up with a decent plan. So write a short story about getting lost. I am immediately going to model this idea that I think, okay, I'm going to write a sentence that's going to sum up my story. A walker gets lost in a mountain snowstorm. So if I'm imagining I'm sitting in the exam hall and that's the question that I was given, write a short story about getting lost, I'm now imagining that I'm going to try and think of one sentence that my story might be about. So in one sentence I think, getting lost, I like mountains and walking, so I'm going to say a walker gets lost in a mountain snowstorm. I feel like that's something that I could write about quite convincingly. So that's a technique for you to use. You look at your narrative title and then you try and summarise in just one sentence what your story is going to be about. And this is a planning idea that I borrowed from a professional writer who uses this to provoke all of the novels that he goes on to write. So I can guarantee this is a strategy worth trying out. So a walker gets lost in a mountain snowstorm. That's my summary of the kind of story I'm going to try and write. But that doesn't really help me get started, does it? It just gives me my main idea. So this is what I do next. Around my one sentence, I start to explode it with questions. Now, you might not write these questions down in an exam, you might not have time to do that, but you can train yourself to spend a bit of time thinking through the questions, because what happens is every question you ask yourself, you will start to develop an idea for a story. So a walker gets lost in a mountain storm. In the grey thought bubbles there, I'm concentrating on this character of a walker, and I'm thinking, right, why is he, she alone anyway? Who is this character? What can I think about them? What ideas am I going to have about who they are? Are they experienced? Are they fit? Are they healthy? So asking myself those questions, if I'm the writer here, I'm going to start to get some ideas about my character. Then in the blue, I'm starting to look at that word lost. And I'm thinking, well, how long have they been lost? How did they get lost? Does anyone even know they're in trouble? Then moving round clockwise to the yellow, I'm there looking at that word snowstorm. How long has it been snowing? Is there an avalanche risk? And then the word mountain in the green bubbles. Had the walker even made it to the summit? Where is the mountain? Are we in Britain? Are we somewhere else? So all of those questions are starting to give me ideas in my head. And what that enables me to do in my 5-minute planning time is go back to the idea of that roller coaster ride and think, right, how can I turn this into my 6-point story? So I'm going to start off by thinking, I'd like to write the story in first person rather than third person. I'm going to think about features disappearing in the snowstorm and the walker feeling lost and panicked. So that's my setup. That's how I'm going to set up the story. Then, using all those thought bubble ideas I came up with, my inciting incident, I'm going to imagine that the map has flown away in gale-forced winds. So that's going to be the next thing that happens in my story. Then my rising action, I'm going to describe that the walker, or me as the walker, begins to follow a gully, but the weather's worsening and there's no phone signal. Then when I get to the climax, I'm going to talk about realising that the reader realising that actually, as the walker, our main character, wasn't alone, we'd been describing them on their own up until this point, but they actually have left an injured friend behind and they're going to get help. And that's a climactic moment because you realise that someone is already in a lot more danger than even this lost walker is. The falling action, darkness falls, the storm's still raging, the walker starts to fall asleep in the snow, so danger sign, but at the same time things are kind of getting quieter and calming down. And then for my resolution, I'm going to switch from the first person narration to a different style of writing and have a mountain rescue report of 2 fatalities that have happened in the mountain storm. So when the reader gets to the end, they realise that both the friend and the main character have not survived the incident. So that's just an idea of how you can turn an idea of all those thought bubbles based on that one sentence into something that follows that roller coaster ride of a story. So I said at the beginning that the main purpose of this is to help you know how to revise for narrative writing. We've gone through lots of techniques and things that you could go away and do more revision around, but let's look at how you could sit and practice actually writing in response to a question. So we're going to go through a series of slides. If you've watched my descriptive writing video, then it's very similar to that. What I've done is for each one, so if we look at this one of a race, a running race, there are 2 45-minute questions. Write a short story based on a time you've been in a competition, or write a story about a race as suggested by this picture. So if you've got 45 minutes and you want to have a go at writing an exam style question, you could choose to do either of those. But on each slide there's also a mini writing challenge, something that you can do in 5 or 10 minutes to help you practice a particular strategy. So the mini writing challenge for this photograph is to write 1 paragraph in which you simply introduce a key character. So give that a go. In this next photograph, you could choose write a short story that begins with a sentence, "It was always on the same park bench that I saw them," or write a story about a pet as suggested by this picture. Or if you don't have as much time, your mini writing challenge, create a drop introduction that takes the reader by surprise. Write a short story about a time you felt trapped, or write a story about a prison as suggested by this picture, Or 5-10 minutes, write 2 paragraphs from different parts of the story, but that both share a recurring motif. So that's that idea of a recurring idea, a theme that threads its way through the story. Write a short story about a survivor. That doesn't have to be in any way linked to that photograph. Or write a story about a runaway, as suggested by this picture. Or for your mini writing challenge, just write 1 paragraph, 5-10 minutes, that introduces a flashback. Write the opening of a story in which a travel-themed adventure begins, or write a story about a journey, as suggested by this picture. Or for your mini writing challenge, write a paragraph from the story using language to create a sense of foreboding. So that sense that something's going to go wrong, that something bad's going to happen, it just hasn't happened yet. Write a short story based on a time you experienced extreme weather conditions. That wouldn't have to be rain. Write a short story about getting caught out in the rain, as suggested by this picture. Or for your mini writing challenge, write a paragraph that creates pathetic fallacy. And I should point out at this point that where in an exam paper it says write a story about getting caught out in the rain or a time where you have felt, for example, it doesn't have to be based on your real life experiences. You can obviously be imaginative and make something up. I love this picture. Write a short story that begins with the sentence, "There was nothing unusual about the postbox at the end of my road." Write a story about a strange disappearance, as suggested by this picture. Or for your mini writing challenge, just create one of those drop introductions that really takes the reader by surprise. Write a short story that ends with the sentence, "There was silence, only interrupted by the splash of the phone hitting the water and sinking to the bottom of the river." Write a story about an unusual text message, as suggested by this picture. Or for 5-10 minutes, if you just want a quick revision task, write a paragraph that includes tense dialogue between 2 characters. Write a short story about bravery, so that doesn't have to be in any way inspired by the picture. Write a story about a protester, as suggested by the picture. Or for your mini writing challenge, write 1 paragraph from a first-person narrator and then rewrite the same events from the perspective of a third-person narrator. It's a really nice strategy for helping you think about which you're most comfortable writing in and how first-person suits some story ideas better than others. Write a short story about a haunted house, or write a story about Halloween as suggested by this picture. Or for your mini writing challenge, create a creepy paragraph that heavily uses the senses of smell and sound. Write a short story about an unusual experience at school, or write a story about a futuristic classroom as suggested by this picture. For your mini writing challenge, write a paragraph in which you create a sense of rising action using at least 3 different types of punctuation, but not including a full stop. Write a story about a journey, or write a story about a walk home from school, as suggested by this picture. And your mini writing challenge, so 5-10 minutes, write a paragraph that includes personification. So another fascinating photograph here. Write a short story about climate change. Write a story about an abandoned house, as suggested by this picture. Or, if you have less time, just write the concluding paragraph, but your challenge is to leave the reader feeling worried and sad. An interesting image here. Write a short story that ends with the sentence, "Lesson learned, I will never approach an abandoned bike again." Or write a story about an abandoned bike, as suggested by this picture. And your mini writing challenge, write the introductory paragraph to the story, ensuring that you effectively hook in your reader. Write a short story about a time someone goes missing. Write a story about a game of hide and seek, as suggested by this picture. Or for your mini writing challenge, write a paragraph in which you really concentrate on sentence variety. Sentence starters including the, then, he, she, they, next and suddenly are banned. Write a short story about the theme of captivity. Or write a story about a visit to the zoo, as suggested by this picture. And for your mini writing challenge, write a paragraph that uses a metaphor. Write a short story about a dangerous meeting. Or write a story about a mountain adventure, as suggested by this picture. Your mini writing challenge is to write a paragraph that describes 2 characters, but I'd like you to use the show don't tell technique to suggest to your reader that one of the characters is to be admired and the other is to be feared. write a short story about a terrifying car journey. You can see where that has come from when you look at the picture. For the second one, write a story about a dinosaur as suggested by this picture. And your mini writing challenge, write a paragraph that includes a simile and one simple sentence. Write a short story that begins with the sentence, "Last year a tree saved my life." Write a story about nature as suggested by this picture. Or for your mini writing challenge, write one paragraph that uses a range of different sentence starting techniques: simile, adverb, prepositional phrase. I think this could be my favourite image. Write a short story about a time you felt lonely. Or write a story about an astronaut as suggested by this picture. So that would be your 45-minute tasks, but if you've only got 5 to 10 minutes, have a go at writing just one paragraph that suggests that the story is a comedy, and then another which fits the tragedy genre. So really good challenge to test your ability to switch the mood through your language there. And that's our final picture. So a good thing to do now you've watched through the video is then, as you're looking to do little bits of revision for this question, you can just pop back into the video, pause on one of the slides and just have a go at that writing exercise. And hopefully now we've got to the end of the video, you have revised that idea of narrative writing, but you've actually got some ideas for your own revision and how to go forward and do revision yourself. So we've explored planning strategies. So you've got the idea of having that one sentence that you sort of explode with ideas before you link it to the roller coaster story structure, or you use the idea of the drop start and the flash and the zoom. We've revised the techniques that will help you write a cohesive, engaging and convincing short story. So we've talked through quite a few things, and in those mini activities you can see that those techniques are being practiced. And finally, we've busted that myth that you can't revise for a creative writing question, because you've now got many ways in which you can now do little 5-minute exercises, 10-minute exercises or 45-minute exercises to really increase your confidence and your competence in being able to write a really good narrative. I hope that's been helpful.